is my neighbor? Is the question that arises today. And with that, I start. It's a simple question, yes, but as it turns out, it is a haunting one, it seems to me, given the way Jesus uses it, right, in the dialogue recorded in Luke 10. If you have you probably don't have a copy of Scripture before you, perhaps you have it on the phone. If not, no problem. You're very likely familiar with the details. First, however, a brief autobiographical note before I begin. In my own journey, I was forced to wrestle with this question, who is my neighbor, in two important seasons of life. One, living in Europe for about 4 years in Germany, or what actually was West Germany at the time. Who was my neighbor? Everyone, but every neighbor was a stranger. That was difficult. As an American, not just vacationing abroad, living abroad, and those of you who have grown up abroad or spent significant time abroad know what I'm talking about. It breaks you, doesn't it? But it's an incubator in which you learn a lot. And I was forced to wrestle with, who is my neighbor? Because every neighbor was a stranger. The second season was the time in which I was doing criminal justice research in Washington, as my brother just suggested. That was difficult. It was a jolt. It was a great joy, but it was difficult to answer the question, who is my neighbor, and also continue to research violent crime, work on issues such as the death penalty, and ask, how is criminal justice neighbor love? The answer is not so readily apparent. Okay, part two. What is truly remarkable about the parable of the Good Samaritan, as I suggested, is its familiarity everywhere. Even people who have no religious faith, so-called, are familiar with it. Who hasn't really heard of it? The Good Samaritan really challenges us because of its cultural influence. Rembrandt and Van Gogh painted him. Sculptors sculpt him. As a matter of fact, I'm thinking of a sculpture that's on the campus of a school not that far from here, on the mall of Loma Linda University, which I think is just, south of San Bernardino, is that right? Yeah. Social services, disaster agencies, hospitals especially are named after him, right? In the Chattanooga area, I'm from Chattanooga, Tennessee, so it was almost coast-to-coast flight getting here on Sunday. We have, in our area, I counted them 4 Good Samaritan something or others. There's a church, there are 2 social service agencies, and some sort of Good Samaritan Alliance. I'm not sure what that is. Most of you are well aware that parables are central, are they not, to Jesus' teaching method. Isn't it interesting? I think 40 to 50 parables are recorded in the gospel narratives. That is an amazing frequency. It's important to remember, I think, that the parable is a method used in wisdom literature. That's a genre, is it not? By the way, if you ever have an opportunity to take a course in wisdom literature at Talbot, by all means do it. I promise you, you will not regret it. A parable, it needs to be said to begin with, differs from an allegory in significant ways. Perhaps the primary difference is this. In an allegory, all the details are having some sort of spiritual meaning, right? Just think of Pilgrim's Progress, right? Everything, everywhere he went, and everything he encountered had, what, a name or a meaning. Not so with parables. They are, shall we say, word pictures, simply to illustrate a real-life scenario and situation. And that's why I think there's a link, perhaps a helpful link between the parable that we're going to look at this morning and contemporary geopolitics. Brief summary of the narrative in Luke, with which you're familiar. 2 parts. First of all, Jesus is engaging a lawyer, that is a teacher of the law, or the Torah, on the question, who is my neighbor? The parable, then, is used by Jesus as an answer to that question. And doubtless, his answer is going to offer a bit of a shock, I think, to his listeners, including the lawyer himself. Initially, the lawyer challenges with a question. What must I do? Note the ethical direction of that question. It concerns law. It doesn't concern necessarily proper belief. It concerns ethical obligations of authentic belief. It's interesting then, what is Jesus' response? He answers with a question himself. Well, what is your understanding of what's written in the law, right? And the lawyer replies correctly, and he's commended by Jesus. What does he do? He cites the double command, right? The great commandment, love God, love your neighbor as yourself. Oh, well, but who's my neighbor is the following question. And the answer to that is lodged in the parable, the Good Samaritan. I would say that the lawyer ends up being impaled on the hook that he devised. In any case, accordingly, you're familiar with the details. A certain man was traveling down, and the literary expression here in Luke, I think, is significant. The road from Jerusalem to Jericho is literally a 25, 28, 3,000-foot descent. Jerusalem was about, I think, at least 2,500 feet above sea level. And Jericho was several hundred feet, I think, below sea level. So it was literally a downward trajectory. But it also, I say but, maybe because of that, it was of its winding, because of its topography and the nature of this road, it was considered by Jesus' day, it was called the Road of Blood. It was infamous because of robberies, murders, thievery, and debauchery that occurred along the way. So anyone who traveled it probably was well aware that there were going to be gang attacks, perhaps gang rapes, there will be thuggery, and certainly he is a victim. He's twice undignified. He's robbed, beaten, and stripped thrice, not twice, right? And then a third traveler, after two official religious representatives of Jewish faith decide to pass on by a Levite and a priest. The third, we're told, is a Samaritan, takes him, nurses him, loads him on his donkey, takes him to the nearest inn, and tells the innkeeper, look, take care of him until I get back, and I will repay you for all your trouble. Now notice again here what's going on in the parable. Jesus flips everything, doesn't he? There's an inversion. And one of the most important parts of this flipping is to cast a Samaritan as the virtuous and compassionate, the gracious, I want to tie to your theme, merciful neighbor. Indeed, yes, Samaritans were neighbors geographically in the first century of Jews, yeah. And we learn that, we get that idea from, I think, John 4, right? Jesus is interacting with the Samaritan woman. But they were not considered by Jews neighbors in the neighborly sense. And of course, this goes back to what? 8th century, when Assyria conquered northern kingdom, Israel. Tensions between the two existed since then. So we're getting just a small glimpse, perhaps by Jesus in John 4, but here it's just being inverted and flipped without any explanation, which would have been scandalous to the person listening to the story, would it not have? Yeah. Now let's think together for a moment. What are the questions raised by the parable? At the most basic level, I would say, in asking the question, what makes the Samaritan good? And that word, by the way, is not included in the text. Central to that goodness is the answer to the question, who is my neighbor? Yes, as I indicated, the lawyer answered correctly, but it seems to me that he might have had a wrong view of its application. And that's my burden, that's my interest in being with you this morning, the application of the Good Samaritan ethics, part 3. At this point, I'd like to apply the Good Samaritan approach to being a neighbor by extending its application a bit, and I hope you will indulge me in that. Please note that the mercy and grace shown by the Samaritan takes the form of, let's say, justice and love. Justice and neighbor love are interlocking. I'm struck, not just by people in the wider culture, I'm struck by how much in the church, among Christians, justice and love are divorced very often. The perception is that justice is hard, cold, and personal, whereas charity, love is warm, sentimental, and personal. And as I said yesterday in several classes, nonsense. There's a symmetry there. They're unified. And when they're taken apart, we do great damage to the Christian ethic. And as evidence of that, I simply want to cite the correct answer by the lawyer, which Jesus affirms, the great commandment, love God, love your neighbor. But note the qualification, loving as yourself. Guess what? This is nothing other than the so-called golden rule. What's the golden rule? That's right. Do to others as you want done to you. What's the negative side of the golden rule? Do not do to others as you don't want to do to you. I'm going to suggest, for our purposes this morning, a third application of the golden rule. Do not allow to be done to others, whether individuals, people groups, nations, what you would not want done to yourself. It seems to me that the golden rule, expressed through the Good Samaritan ethic, makes for good social and public policy. Truth be told, in my view, it should be the basis, the foundation for all good policy. And I don't think you have to be a Christian to affirm that. That's basic truth. That's like the natural law. All people have an awareness of that, don't they? Tell me, do you know anyone who would deny the goodness of the Samaritan? Do you know anyone who would deny the golden rule as being true? I'm not talking about faith, in-house or out-house. I'm just anyone. Probably not. Wow, it would make for good policy. Consider its applications with regard to domestic policy. In the realm of criminal justice and all of society, civil society, what do? We uphold the rule of law, unless, of course, the laws are unjust, okay? We protect our communities, do we not? And we seek to guard the common good. In that kind of environment, all people then flourish. And I think all benefit from that. That crosses all ethnic and economic barriers. The same applies, it seems to me, to foreign policy. On sad occasions where states or regimes have committed outrageous human rights violations, genocide, or aggression against other people groups, guess what? The Golden Rule ethic, illustrated by the Good Samaritan, requires that fellow human beings, based on our shared human dignity, that's not just a Christian thing, that's not just a Biola thing, it's not just an American thing, it's a human thing, respond accordingly to the helpless and the defenseless. It's in this context that I've been invited here for several days to speak at Biola and Talbot, to examine the moral wisdom and principles undergirding the just war tradition. Let me, for a minute or so, just identify certain assumptions that undergird this tradition. For example, it assumes a realism about human nature and the human condition, acknowledging that good and evil are a part of the human condition. I think wise policy takes that into account. I think a flawed anthropology makes for bad public policy. Another, as I've already suggested, it assumes that justice and neighbor love, justice and charity are wed, not divorced. To me, it's very significant that Thomas Aquinas, whose treatment of the subject of war has been really the starting point for most just war proponents, he discusses the matter of war not in the context, not under the rubric of justice, but guess what? Under the rubric of caritas, charity. Wow. And the church father Augustine agrees. He argues, and he's living in a day of real decomposition and degeneration in the empire. He's arguing that yes, punishment, force, coercive force, even lethal force can express charity. And he says that it can express that charity at three levels. It expresses, think of that, even lethal force could be charitably motivated, well-intended. It could be, not always is, that's not my argument, that's not his. It could be charity to the criminal to prevent him or her I want to use my pronouns correctly today, okay. Yeah. But usually it's a him. From doing evil. Is that charity? Yeah. It could be charity toward all of society which has been victimized by criminal wrongdoing and is watching. And it could be charity toward future criminals to prevent them from doing evil. Augustine calls this, and I hope you hold on to this expression. It's not mine, it's his. Benevolent harshness. Think of that. Benevolent harshness. Does that strike you as contradictory? Well, benevolent harshness. I like that. Another assumption of the just war tradition, it distinguishes between force and violence, okay? Many of our pacifist friends are nonviolent activists. They stress the importance of nonviolence. Well, the just war tradition distinguishes between force and violence. Force being that measure of power that upholds law, politics, and civil society. Violence being that measure of power that destroys or undermines law and politics. That distinction, it seems to me, is very, very important. Another assumption of the tradition is that peace must be morally qualified. There can be, do you believe this? There can be an unjust peace. Think, for example, the mafia, terrorists, pirates, banditry. Yeah? They work very hard to establish an orbit of peace around them so that they can carry on their vile business. And then finally, another important assumption of the tradition is to assume a symmetry or unity of both ends and means. Not just should we not intervene, but how do we conduct justly that a symmetry. The ends and means agree. Part 4. Before I conclude this morning, permit me to extend the application now of the parable to real-world geopolitics, as I've already suggested. What happened in the story of the Good Samaritan? What are the root facts? As I noted, an unidentified traveler, and we're not told, he's probably a Jew, but we're not told who he is, was victim of a vicious assault, beaten to a pulp, stripped, robbed, and left for dead. The story mirrors a real-life scenario. What happens in our world, our fallen world? The same among individuals, among people groups, among nations. Let's return now to the question at hand this morning. Who is my neighbor? And extend that application. And let me ask you, had the Good Samaritan come upon the beating, the thuggery, as it happened? As it happened, would neighbor love have required that he coercively attempt to stop it? Another question, would neighbor love been expressed if he had decided, I'm going to be part of a security or police patrol on this dangerous 17-mile stretch of road? I think it could have. My argument this morning is quite simply that the Good Samaritan model asks us to think about and ask, what might neighbor love require in a real-world context? And again, recall the application, the third application of the Golden Rule. Do not allow to be done to others what you would not want done to you. It seems to me, as I keep repeating, the Good Samaritan ethic and the Golden Rule ethic make for good, sound public policy, whether domestic or foreign. Well, I conclude. Not once more is it necessary to note the unity of the great commandment, love God, love your neighbor as yourself. We probably need to hear it again, but recall how that is qualified. Love your neighbor. How? As yourself. Yeah. That is, as you yourself wish to be treated, which exposes the lawyer's motives in the narrative, but it also exposes ours, does it not? And note how the parable ends. Jesus tells the lawyer, go and do likewise. So it's not just about knowing, it's about doing. It's ethical. Who is our neighbor? What's our ethical obligation to a hurting world? Well, we do to others as, we don't do to others as, and we don't allow to be done to others as. You fill in the blank. Before I close, I think it needs emphasizing, please hear me, and I say this in love. I think it needs emphasizing that police, law enforcement agents, civil government service, diplomats, politicians do not have dirty hands because of the work they on occasion must carry out, which at times will mean the taking of other lives for the preventing of evil, for the encouragement of good, and for the protection of the innocent. That is not a lesser evil, as often will be claimed, even within house by fellow Christians. Rather, they perform a virtuous and a necessary good. Now, I read your minds and I know how you're objecting. Yes, of course, wrong motives. Yes, of course, imperfection affects public servants. Yes, of course, a law enforcement agent can be unjust. But that does not mean a commitment to do that is wrong. Our commitment to help to do that is necessary. It's being a good Samaritan. It fulfills the golden rule. On occasion, brothers and sisters, on sad occasions, it may be necessary to intervene on behalf of the innocent third party. And again, Jesus does not teach in Matthew 5, as recorded, turn the other cheek of an innocent third party. The context there is personal. It's self-defense. There we're free not to defend ourselves. We are not free not to defend the innocent third party. Think of that. You may agree, disagree with me, but think of the implications of that. And let me just finish by saying many, not all of us here in this auditorium, but many of us are called to this sort of work, whether it's politics, diplomacy. My sister was a diplomat before she retired. As the brother indicated, I did public policy work before I entered the classroom full time. Many of us are called to these kinds of work, to the marketplace. That's noble. That's every bit as high a calling as being a pastor or a missionary. I'm sorry, and I have no axe to grind against professional missionaries or church workers, no. But the fact is, most of us are called to the marketplace. 99% of all of us here in this community are called to work in the marketplace. All of us have vocational callings. Hey, and the joy and the challenge of being in a place like this is to discover them. Lord, how are you developing my gifts? How are you leading me? How can I learn? How am I growing? How am I maturing? But many of us, not all, are called to these sorts of very public, very strategic types of services. And if God does that, he gives us the grace and the mercy to carry out those vocational callings, even if it means coercive intervention in a broken world where the defense of the innocent and the suffering needs to be done. I close with this. I mentioned wisdom literature earlier. This comes from wisdom literature as recorded in the book of Proverbs. Heed the admonition in wisdom literature. Proverbs 24. Rescue those being led away to death. Pardon me. Hold back those staggering towards slaughter. Well, if you say, but we knew nothing about this, does not he who weighs the heart perceive it? Does not he who guards your life know it? And will he not repay each person according to what he has done? Since chapel is not the context for question and answer, I just want to say I'd be delighted and honored to hang around after chapel to interact with any of you with questions, comments, objections. And I just want to say, may the Lord bless each of you in your studies here at Biola and Talbot. Thank you for having me.
Discover who you're called to be at Biola University, a leading Christ-centered university in Los Angeles, with programs on campus and online. Subscribe for more of our videos and learn more at biola.edu.